They spent years trying to make me small until my daughter turned the tables and exposed everything they'd hidden behind polished smiles and estate plans. My name is Rachel Monroe, and the moment my daughter grabbed my hand and said, "Mom, we need to leave," now I knew everything I had once believed about my family was about to shatter. It was a crisp Saturday evening in early October, the kind of night where the air smelled like burning leaves and expensive perfume. My parents, Helen and Douglas Monroe, were celebrating their 45th wedding anniversary with an over-the-top banquet at the Charleston Yacht Club. The chandeliers sparkled like ice above linen-draped tables, and a soft jazz trio played near the bar, crooning out classics. Everyone was dressed to the nines. I had borrowed a navy gown from a friend, tightened it around my waist with a vintage belt, and hoped it would hide just how out of place I felt among the sea of designer outfits and fake smiles. I had told myself I was attending for my parents, for their legacy, for my kids. But the truth was, I still wanted their approval. Some part of me still craved it even after the divorce, even after the way they had treated me like a burden instead of a daughter. Maybe this party was a chance to turn a corner. Or at least, I had hoped. My daughter Ellie, 16 and sharper than anyone gave her credit for, had been quiet all evening. She played with the pearl bracelet her grandmother insisted she wear and avoided eye contact with nearly everyone. I figured she was just annoyed to be dragged to another formal event with people twice her age. But something in her body language was off, tense alert, like she was scanning for danger. I first noticed it during dinner. We were seated at a long table near the front, close enough to the stage where the speeches would be made later. My younger son Milo was 2 seats down from me, giggling with my father. They'd given him a mocktail in a champagne glass, and he thought it made him a big boy. I smiled despite myself. He was just happy to be included. Ellie, though, wasn't smiling. She kept glancing toward the entrance where new guests filtered in. Her jaw tightened when my parents stood to greet someone I didn't immediately recognize. Then I saw him, Zach, my ex-husband. The man who had walked out on me 2 years ago, who had drained our joint savings account and moved in with his 24-year-old assistant without warning. He walked in like he owned the place, hand in hand with that same woman, dressed like they were royalty returning from exile. And my parents. They welcomed him with open arms. Literally. My father clapped him on the back like a long-lost son. My mother kissed his cheek. I sat there stunned. No one had told me they were invited. No one had warned me. I turned to Ellie, trying to make sense of it. But she wasn't surprised. She just whispered, "I knew it," under her breath, and gripped the tablecloth with one hand. I wanted to leave then. I wanted to take both kids and walk out. But I told myself to stay composed, to be polite for Milo's sake, for my parents' reputation, for the illusion of grace. I swallowed the embarrassment like sour wine and forced a smile. It wasn't until the cake was rolled out, massive, tiered, covered in gold leaf and orchids, that Ellie leaned in close and gripped my arm. Her voice was low, urgent. "Mom, we have to leave, right now." "What?" "Why?" I whispered back, alarmed. She looked at me, eyes cold and blazing at the same time. "I'll explain in the car. Please just trust me." And I did. Not because I understood, but because something in her tone broke through the fog of decorum I'd wrapped myself in all night. She wasn't being dramatic. She was scared. And I knew in my bones that if we didn't walk out of that room right then, I might not be able to walk away at all. As we made our way through the hallway of the yacht club, Ellie's grip on my hand didn't loosen. If anything, it got tighter. Her pace was brisk, her head low, like she didn't want anyone to spot us. I kept glancing back over my shoulder, half expecting someone to call out our names or demand to know where we were going. But the laughter and clinking glasses from the banquet hall only grew more distant. Once outside, the air hit me like a truth I hadn't wanted to face, cool, biting, and sobering. The valet looked up in surprise as we approached. I handed him our ticket without a word, trying to keep my hands from shaking. Ellie didn't speak until we were in the car, doors shut, engine purring low. I turned to her. "Okay. What's going on?" She pulled out her phone and stared at it for a second, then back at me. I didn't want to tell you inside. I needed to get you away from them first. Them, I echoed. You mean Grandma and Grandpa? She nodded. And Zach, all of them. I stared at her waiting. I know you thought they were being supportive lately, she said, voice low but steady. The calls, the dinners, the gifts for Milo. But they weren't supporting you, Mom. They were setting something up, preparing, for what I asked, my voice barely a whisper, to cut you out. I blinked. Cut me out of what? Ellie's hands clenched in her lap. Everything. I shook my head. No, that's not possible, they said. They said what they knew you needed to hear, she interrupted. So you'd keep showing up. So you'd keep trusting them. But I've been watching, listening, and tonight confirmed it. She opened a folder on her phone and passed it to me. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at. Screenshots, notes, names, a couple of scanned emails. One email was from my mother to an estate planner I didn't recognize. Please finalize the trust modifications before the anniversary. Zach has agreed to the proposed conditions. Another was from Zach to my father. We'll need Rachel out of the picture to finalize the transfer. Milo should stay in the family. He's the future. I felt like I'd been punched in the chest. They're planning to make Zach Milo's full guardian, Ellie said. And they're working with him to transfer the Monroe Lake house, your inheritance, to him. It's already in motion. They just needed you distracted long enough to make it official. My mouth went dry. But how do you know this is real? I didn't until tonight. I overheard Grandpa talking to Zach before dinner. They were in the wine cellar. I went down to get a soda and the door was cracked. Grandpa was saying, "She'll never see it coming. All she wants is a seat at the table." I closed my eyes. It all made sense now. The sudden generosity. The over-the-top party. The inclusion of Zach and his girlfriend, like it was all meant to provoke me or maybe distract me from what was really happening behind closed doors. I opened my eyes again and looked at Ellie. "Why didn't you tell me earlier?" "I tried," she said. "But you wanted to believe they'd changed. You always want to believe that." The truth in her words stung. Ellie leaned closer, her voice softening. "I'm not saying they don't love you. I'm saying they love control more. And they don't know what to do with you when you don't play along." A silence settled between us, thick and bitter. I stared at the glowing dashboard, the quiet hum of the engine doing nothing to settle my nerves. "What do?" I finally asked. Ellie didn't hesitate. "Fight." I looked at her again, really looked. Her eyes didn't waver. There was no doubt, no fear. Just fierce, unwavering loyalty. "They think you're alone," she said. "But you're not. I'm here. And I've got proof. But we have to move fast." As I pulled out of the parking lot and onto the coastal highway, something inside me shifted. For the first time in a long time, I stopped hoping they'd come around. I started preparing for war. The road home felt longer than usual. Ellie sat in the passenger seat, scrolling through her phone, her thumb moving quickly as she organized screenshots, notes, and recordings into labeled folders. I kept glancing at her, not just as a mother, but now almost like an ally. A teammate in a battle I hadn't known I was fighting until that night. My chest still burned with disbelief. Zach. My parents. My own family plotting behind my back. And worse, using Milo as their leverage. It felt like I had been walking through my life asleep, and tonight was the brutal, jarring wake-up call. "Do you think they've already done it?" I asked quietly, eyes fixed on the road. Ellie looked up. "I think they're close. But they haven't filed the custody petition yet, not officially." "And the lake house," she hesitated. "That one's trickier. From the email trail, it looks like they've already drafted the deed transfer. If you don't contest it soon, it could be final before the end of the month." I gripped the steering wheel tighter. The lake house had been in the Monroe family for generations. My grandmother's rocking chair was still on the porch. I spent every summer there, growing up, learning how to swim, helping paint the shutters, watching fireflies from the dock with my dad. He used to tell me, "This will be yours one day, Rach. It's where our memories live." And now he was signing it over to my ex-husband. When we pulled into the apartment complex, Milo was already asleep in the back seat. Ellie helped carry him inside while I unlocked the door. Once we tucked him in, we sat at the kitchen table under the soft glow of the overhead light. My hands trembled as I poured myself a glass of water. "You said there were recordings," I asked. Ellie nodded. "Just audio on my phone. I started recording once I realized they were talking about you, about us." She played a few short clips. One was my father's voice, calm and businesslike, as if discussing a merger. "Zach's more stable. We need someone who can manage things long-term. Rachel's creative. That's not what the trust needs right now." Another clip, my mother's voice, softer, but no less cruel. "She'll get over it. She always does. Just make sure Milo isn't confused during the transition." I pressed my hand to my mouth. "I've also been talking to Aunt Lydia," Ellie said. I blinked. What, Lydia hasn't spoken to anyone in years? She reached out to me on Instagram after I posted about Grandpa's speech last month. She said it sounded familiar, like what he told her before he cut her out of the art gallery trust. My stomach twisted. I had forgotten that entire part of our family history. Lydia, my father's only sister, had been written off after a fight over estate shares years ago. My parents called her unstable and disrespectful. I'd believed them. "She wants to talk to you," Ellie said gently. "She said she has records, documents, emails, things you might need." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My whole life I'd accepted the family narrative as fact. Lydia was difficult. Ellie was dramatic. I was emotional. But maybe that was the script written for women who ask too many questions. I exhaled long and slow. "Ellie, I said you shouldn't have had to do this. You're 16. "I know," she replied. "But someone had to. You were too close to it." She wasn't blaming me, just stating the truth. And it hit harder than any accusation could have. "I just wanted them to see me," I whispered. "To be proud." Ellie leaned over and took my hand. "Mom, screw that. You don't need to be who they want. You just need to be who Milo and I already know you are." I squeezed her hand back, tears stinging my eyes. She wasn't just saving me. She was reminding me who I used to be before I tried so hard to earn love that should have been unconditional. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat up scrolling through emails I hadn't read in months. I found an old shared account I once used with Zach. He hadn't changed the password. And in the drafts folder, more pieces of the puzzle. Plans for strategic inheritance alignment, notes on family legacy continuity, a calendar reminder, October 14th, trust announcement at celebration. That was tonight. They were going to make it official in front of everyone. And if Ellie hadn't stopped me, I would have just stood there and smiled. I woke up the next morning with my back aching from sleeping upright on the couch, and Ellie's laptop still open on the coffee table, her research neatly organized into folders labeled emails, recordings, documents, and chillingly custody. The apartment was silent except for the occasional hum of a car outside. Milo was still sleeping in his room. Ellie, already awake, sat on the floor with a legal pad in her lap, cross-referencing names and timelines like she was prepping for court. I watched her for a moment, wondering how I'd raised a kid with more spine at 16 than I'd had at 36. I poured a cup of coffee and sat beside her. "So," I said, my voice still scratchy, "what's next?" She glanced up. "We need someone outside of their circle. A lawyer they can't touch." I nodded slowly. "You're right." For years, every attorney I'd worked with had been recommended by my father's friends, golf buddies, fraternity brothers, country club connections. The kind of men who called him Doug and who never questioned his version of a story. But this time, I needed someone who didn't care who he was. Ellie reached into her backpack and pulled out a business card. "Aunt Lydia gave me this. Her attorney. She said he specializes in trust disputes and parental manipulation cases." I took the card. "Martin Reyes Family Law and Estate Defense, downtown Charleston. Let's call him," I said. And just like that, we had a plan. But the next piece of the puzzle, what truly set my resolve, came from a photo. Later that day, Ellie was scrolling through the party's official event album online. My cousin Grace had uploaded it to the family Facebook group, hundreds of pictures, all glossy and professionally taken. At first glance, it was everything you'd expect: my parents smiling beside a tiered cake, guests raising glasses and toasts, kids playing with balloons. But then came the image that stopped me cold. There it was, my father, Zach, and Milo centered perfectly in front of the Monroe family crest, hands on shoulders, laughing like a happy three-generation lineage. Framed just so. And me, nowhere to be seen. Not in that photo, not in the next dozen. In fact, the only shots I appeared in were wide-angle crowd pictures, or blurry candids from across the room. But Zach, he was practically the guest of honor. Even Kayla, his mistress-turned-fiancé, had more FaceTime in that album than I did. And then I saw the worst one. It was a group photo near the end of the night. My parents, Zach, Milo, and my father's old business partner, Marvin Ellis, the trustee of the Monroe estate, standing together like a unified team. Kayla was holding Milo's hand. My mother was beaming. The caption, "Future of the Monroe Legacy." I wanted to throw my phone across the room. Ellie sat beside me, quiet. "They're replacing you, Mom." Literally. I nodded, the weight of it crashing down all at once. They're building a narrative. One where I'm not part of the future. One where Zach is the steady hand and I'm unstable, artistic, unfit. "But it won't work," she said firmly. "Not if we get ahead of them." That night, while Milo slept, and I tried not to panic every time I heard my phone buzz, Ellie and I compiled a master folder of everything we had. We made a timeline, cross-referenced legal documents with emails and recordings, and flagged anything we could use to prove intent. And as we worked, something unexpected happened. I stopped feeling like a victim. Instead, I started feeling like a mother defending her children, like a woman reclaiming her name, like someone finally stepping out of the shadow of her family's legacy to protect what actually mattered: my own. The next morning, we drove downtown to meet Martin Reyes. His office was tucked inside a historic brick building near the courthouse. No flashy signage, no receptionist with a headset, just a brass nameplate and the faint smell of coffee and old paper. It was the kind of place that said, "I get results quietly." Martin greeted us himself. He was in his late 40s with sleeves rolled to his elbows, no tie, and eyes that saw everything. After offering us coffee, he sat across from us and folded his hands. So he said simply, "Tell me everything." And we did. For over an hour, Ellie and I laid it all out. The emails, the estate documents, the photos from the party, the recordings, her contact with Aunt Lydia, my father's manipulative tendencies, Zach's sudden reappearance, the fake family narrative building around Milo, the trust transfers, the way my parents had subtly erased me from their story while inserting my ex in my place. Martin didn't interrupt. He took notes, asked the occasional clarifying question, and when we were done, he leaned back and exhaled slowly. "This," he said, tapping the folder Ellie had compiled, "is a classic strategic displacement." I frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means your father and likely your ex are orchestrating a long-term shift in legal and emotional power. They're isolating you from the family's perceived center of gravity while building up Zach and your son Milo as the next generation's anchors. You, meanwhile, are being reframed as a fringe player. Emotional, unreliable, optional." He looked up at me, steady and calm. "The good news is you caught it early. Most people don't realize what's happening until it's too late. But your daughter? She's a genius." Ellie blushed slightly, looking down at her lap. Martin continued. "Here's what we're going to do. First, we'll file a legal hold on the Monroe estate, freeze any property transfers. That stops the lake house from changing hands for now. Second, we'll prepare a countersuit documenting undue influence, parental alienation, and misrepresentation." He tapped another folder. "And third, we prepare for war." I swallowed hard. "Will they come after me harder if we do this?" "They might," he said. "But if they do, they'll expose themselves. And I promise you, with this level of evidence, you're not just defending yourself. You're protecting your children from a cycle that needs to be broken. By the time we left his office, I felt different. Not completely calm, how could I be, but steady. Like the floor beneath me was solid again. And for once, it wasn't a foundation my father had poured. It was mine. But peace didn't last long. That evening, Ellie showed me a screenshot of a group chat from one of my cousins. The family was buzzing. Rumors had spread that I had stormed out of the anniversary party because I was jealous of Zach's presence. Another cousin posted that Rachel has always been dramatic, probably going through one of her moods again. I wasn't surprised. This was how it started. The character assassination, the emotional branding. They didn't come at you with facts. They chipped away at your image until no one believed you were ever credible to begin with. And the worst part, it was working. Milo had started asking questions. Why don't we go to Grandpa's house anymore? Why did Uncle Zach say he's helping me get into the Monroe School? Is it true Daddy's moving into the lake house? I did my best to keep answers neutral, age-appropriate, reassuring. But my heart broke every time I saw confusion in his eyes. They were playing chess with a child who just wanted to feel loved. That night, as I tucked him in, he whispered, "Are you mad at Grandpa?" I froze. "No, honey. I'm just making sure everyone's playing fair. Like the rules in my video games." "Exactly," I said, brushing hair from his forehead. "Even grown-ups need rules." Once he fell asleep, I stood outside his door fighting back tears. They thought they were erasing me, but they didn't count on the one thing they hadn't controlled. My daughter. And now my will. 2 days later, I got a phone call that shifted everything. It wasn't from my parents. Not Zach. Not even Martin. It was from Lydia. Aunt Lydia, my dad's estranged sister, the woman the family had referred to as a train wreck, unstable, emotional for as long as I could remember. She was a phantom in our house, someone I'd only seen in old photo albums before she was scrubbed from the story altogether. I'd grown up believing she'd lost her inheritance because she couldn't be trusted. Now I knew better. "Rachel," she said, as soon as I picked up her voice, firmer than I expected, almost like a school principal. "Your daughter is brave, smarter than I ever was. She says you went through the same thing," I said quietly. She paused. "He did worse." Lydia then told me what my father had done to her 30 years ago. It was supposed to be a routine family announcement at a holiday dinner. He said it was just a little update about the estate. In front of 20 guests, he unveiled a new trust arrangement that had stripped her of her share of the family business and rerouted everything to him and his sons-in-law. She hadn't even known it was happening until the documents had already been signed. The lawyers had been prepped. The public setting had ensured her silence. "I cried in front of the cranberry sauce," she said bitterly. "And everyone told me I was making a scene." My hands clenched into fists. "And then he painted you as unstable." "Exactly," she said. "And you, he's doing it again. Only this time you have Madison." She saved me, I admitted. I would have stood there smiling while they handed over my life. Lydia's voice softened. "He counts on that. Our need to be the good daughter, the gracious one. He weaponizes it." I exhaled the truth, cracking something inside me. "I still remember the moment I realized no amount of obedience would protect me," Lydia said. "He doesn't love us as daughters. He loves what we represent. Power, legacy, loyalty, assets. Not people." "I want to fight back," I said finally. "Not just for me, for Madison, for Milo." "Then I'll help you," she said. "I have file statements, bank records, things I kept even when I thought I'd never use them." "You kept all that?" "I kept it," she said, "because I knew someday someone else would need it." Later that afternoon, we met Lydia at her modest home just outside Mount Pleasant. She lived alone, surrounded by books and paintings and dogs. The kind of peaceful life that screamed freedom, freedom from the weight of someone else's narrative. She opened a battered filing cabinet and handed me folders marked with dates, names, annotations. "This," she said, "is your insurance." As I flipped through pages, trust deeds with her name crossed out, letters from lawyers advising silence, handwritten notes from my father implying she was unwell, I felt the rage boil higher. He had done this before, and everyone believed him. Just like they would have believed him again, until Ellie intervened. When we got back home that evening, Madison was waiting at the table with a stack of printed emails and a highlighter in hand. "Grandpa just texted me," she said, not looking up. "He said you're not thinking clearly and that he hopes I'll see reason." "Already starting the campaign," I muttered. "Same playbook." Ellie handed me her phone. I responded. Her message was short, fierce. "Please don't message me again. My mother is clear-headed. You're just not used to being challenged." I looked at her, pride swelling. "You sure about this?" "I've never been more sure of anything," she said. That night, I sat in bed with the lights off, listening to Ellie brush her teeth down the hall, Milo talking in his sleep. And I made a silent vow. "You don't get to rewrite me out of my family. Not again. Not ever." I met with Martin Reyes early the next morning. He already had a plan in place. A legal freeze had been filed on the Monroe estate's asset transfers just after midnight. With the supporting documentation, Ellie and Lydia had provided recordings, emails, and trust history. Martin said we had leverage most people only dream of in these situations. But what truly rocked the strategy session was a new email forwarded to him late the night before from Zach. It was sent to my parents' estate attorney and CC'd to my father. The subject line read, "Finalizing custody shift proposal." Inside was a PDF attachment outlining a draft petition for full legal custody of Milo, with me listed only as a secondary guardian with visitation allowances pending agreement. Pending agreement. That was their plan. Gimme scraps if I stayed quiet, nothing if I pushed back. I stared at the printout in silence, trying to wrap my head around it. This is legal?" I asked, voice thin. Martin shook his head. "Not yet. But it's the strongest signal we've seen. They were about to make a move." He looked at me seriously. "But now we make the first one." That afternoon, Martin submitted a cease and desist letter to my parents, and Zach officially notifying them of our intent to block any modifications to custody, estate planning, or trust reallocations without my express legal consent. We also served notice that any attempts at further manipulation, especially involving Milo, would be documented for potential civil proceedings. But even with the paperwork moving in my favor, my heart weighed heavy. Because while I could fight in court, I couldn't fight the whispers. The next day, Milo came home from school with his head down. "Grandpa says I don't have to live in the apartment forever," he mumbled. He said soon I might get a big room with my own TV at the lake house. I crouched in front of him. "Milo, you're not moving anywhere unless it's something we talk about as a family. You and me, okay?" He looked confused, but Daddy said it was already happening. And there it was, the erosion of my role spoken so casually by an 8-year-old who didn't understand he was being groomed. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat up rewatching the party videos posted by relatives frame by frame, and then I saw it. A clip during the cake cutting. My father toasting Zach, saying the future of Monroe men. 3 generations right here. He had pulled Milo in close, one hand on Zach's shoulder and the other gripping my son's back. And me, nowhere near that photo frame. I showed the clip to Ellie. She stared at it for a long time. "They're not just replacing you," she whispered. "They're trying to rewrite Milo's memory before it's even finished forming." It hit me like a wave. They weren't just taking assets. They were taking identity. If Milo started to believe Zach was his only path to a better life, that Grandpa was the source of power, of success, of belonging, then what did that make me? The outsider. The footnote. Just like Lydia. Just like they'd tried to make Madison. But this time, they underestimated who they were up against. Because while they saw me as disposable, they hadn't factored in the girl sitting beside me at midnight, mapping out timelines with highlighters and a steel gaze. My daughter wasn't scared of them, and she had made me brave again. We finalized our legal strategy by morning, and that afternoon Martin called with news. "They're rattled," he said. "Their attorney just called to clarify intent." Which means they're not as confident as they were 3 days ago. I smiled faintly for the first time in days. "They should be," I replied. It was a rainy Thursday afternoon when I got the invitation. A thick envelope arrived at my apartment, sealed with a gold Monroe family crest. Inside was a formal letter on ivory stationery inviting me to a private family business review scheduled at the Monroe law firm the following Tuesday. Beneath that heading was a single line that made my stomach turn. Finalization of estate continuity decisions and beneficiary realignment. It wasn't just a meeting. It was an ambush. They want you there so they can corner you, Martin said when I showed him the letter. They're hoping to pressure you into signing documents under the guise of a family discussion. Don't go. I agreed. But I also knew something else. If they were desperate enough to push forward with this, they might do something reckless. And that made me nervous, not just for me, but for Milo. Ellie felt it too. That night, as we double-checked our digital files, she turned to me with a grim expression. We need to get Milo away from Grandpa, at least until this is over. I nodded, agreed. The very next morning, I called Milo's school and updated the pickup permissions list. No more access for Zach. No more unsupervised pickups from my parents. I texted them after. This is non-negotiable. Legal measures have been taken. Minutes later, my phone lit up with calls from both parents. I didn't answer. Instead, I called Aunt Lydia. You did the right thing, she said firmly. They won't stop unless you set boundaries so loud even they can't pretend not to hear them. That same afternoon, we got an unexpected ally, my brother Andrew. For most of our lives, Andrew had played the golden boy role effortlessly. Straight A student, Ivy League graduate, successful investment banker, and most notably, Dad's right-hand man in the family foundation. We hadn't spoken much since my divorce. He'd always kept his distance when things got messy, but he called me out of the blue. I heard about the meeting, he said quietly, and I'm not okay with it. I blinked, confused. You're not? No, he continued. I've been watching them cozy up to Zach for months. I thought it was weird, but I assumed it was temporary. Then I saw the trust documents Martin filed, and I realized they're actually trying to replace you. There was silence for a second. I know you probably don't believe me, he added, but I didn't know it was this bad. I'm sorry. My throat tightened. Why now? Because I've got kids too, he said. And if they did this to you, what's stopping them from doing it to me when I stop playing along? I didn't know what to say. For the first time in years, my older brother sounded human. Not perfect. Not bulletproof. Just a man trying to stop the machine he'd helped keep running. I'll send you what I've got, he promised. Emails, meeting notes, even texts from Dad asking me to refrain from discussing estate matters with Rachel. When I told Ellie, she didn't cheer. She didn't celebrate. She just nodded and said, "They're slipping. Good." But as the pieces fell into place, I couldn't ignore the gnawing sense that something was coming. Something final. A desperate move. And I was right. The next morning, I received another letter, this time from Zach's attorney. It was a formal petition to modify Milo's custody. He was claiming I was emotionally unstable, citing my abrupt behavior at the anniversary party, and suggesting that my financial limitations created an unstable environment for long-term development. I read the words slowly, as if they'd vanish if I blinked too fast. But they didn't vanish. They landed hard, like punches I didn't see coming. Then I read the last line: petitioner proposes primary residence with biological father and approval for educational relocation to Monroe Family Estate. They wanted to move him in, officially. They were ready to finish what they started. But so was I. That night, I sat at the dining table with Ellie and Lydia and reviewed our counterfilings. Martin was already preparing a motion to block the petition, citing manipulation, conflict of interest, and intent to alienate. We had what we needed: the evidence, the testimony, and finally the will to fight. But we also had something stronger: truth. And this time it would speak louder than any lie my father could write on monogrammed letterhead. The custody hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks later, but the real confrontation happened sooner, and it wasn't in a courtroom. It was in the foyer of my parents' house. I hadn't been back in over a year. But that Saturday morning, I drove out there with Ellie beside me and Milo in the back seat, dozing off with his headphones on. Martin had advised against direct contact until after the hearing, but we both agreed this situation had escalated beyond formality. I needed to face them. The estate gates opened automatically when my license plate triggered the security system. That little technological courtesy felt like the last illusion that I still belonged here. We parked by the fountain where Milo used to splash during summer visits. Everything looked pristine, perfect lawn, spotless white columns, the kind of postcard suburban wealth that screamed legacy. Ellie stayed in the car with Milo. "You sure?" she asked. I nodded. "I'll call you if it gets ugly." Inside, I didn't need to announce myself. My mother was already waiting in the grand hallway, arms crossed, dressed in a beige cashmere set like she'd been curated from a magazine. "Well," she said, her voice as dry as the marble beneath us, "I hope you're here to apologize." "Actually," I replied, "I'm here to deliver a message." Before she could respond, my father stepped into view from the study behind her. He looked the same, confident, pressed, calculated. "Rachel," he said with a cold smile, "this could have all been avoided if you had just cooperated." "No," I said calmly. "This could have been avoided if you hadn't tried to erase me." His face darkened. "You've always been dramatic. And you've always mistaken silence for obedience," I snapped back. "But not this time." He took a step closer, lowering his voice. "You're unstable. You're risking Milo's future because of your emotions." I pulled out my phone and pressed play on the audio clip Martin had coached me to use. His own voice filled the air. "Zach's more stable. We need someone who can manage things long-term. Rachel's creative. Then my mother's. She'll get over it. She always does." I watched their expressions freeze. My father's mouth opened slightly. My mother blinked, but said nothing. "I have recordings," I said. "Emails, witnesses, and a full legal team preparing for court." "You're bluffing," my mother said, though. Her voice cracked just a little. I pulled a manila envelope from my bag and placed it gently on the console table. "This is a courtesy copy. The official notice was already delivered to your attorney yesterday." My father didn't touch it. "This is insane," he muttered. "You're turning on your own family. You turned on me when you invited Zach into that party and tried to hand him my son," I said, voice steady. "When you tried to convince an 8-year-old that he was only valuable if he followed your version of legacy. When you told the world I didn't belong." My mother stepped forward now, reaching like she still believed she could talk her way back into control. "Rachel, sweetheart, this isn't you. You don't get to define me anymore," I said, cutting her off. The sound of footsteps behind me made us all turn. Ellie stood in the doorway now, phone in hand, chin lifted. "Just so you know," she said, "we're documenting this conversation too." My mother's face paled. "This is harassment," she snapped. "No," Ellie said quietly. "This is exposure." I turned to my daughter, my ally, my fire starter, and felt something shift inside me. Pride. My father tried one last time. "This path you're on, it won't end well. You'll regret it." I shook my head. "You already do. You just don't know it yet." Without another word, I turned and walked out the front door. When we got back to the car, Milo looked up sleepily. "Are we going back to Grandpa's house later?" Ellie leaned over and said gently, "Not for a while, buddy. We've got better places to be." And we did. Not because they were grander, but because they were ours. The days leading up to the custody hearing felt like walking a tightrope over open flame. While Martin coordinated filings and prepped me for potential courtroom ambushes, Ellie focused on something even more delicate, reaching Milo. It had become painfully clear that my parents and Zach had been feeding him subtle narratives for months. Things like, "Daddy can get you into the best school," or "Grandpa says you'll be a leader in the Monroe family one day." For an 8-year-old, those words weren't just flattering, they were shaping his identity. One evening, as we were cleaning up after dinner, Milo turned to me and asked, "Mom, is it bad to want to live in a big house?" I paused, dish towel in hand. "Of course not. But living in a big house isn't the same as being happy." He tilted his head. "Grandpa says I'd be happier if I lived with Dad." That's when Ellie stepped in. She sat on the floor beside him, cross-legged, pulling out a notebook. "Hey, Milo," she said. "Remember that game we played where we made up rules for our own universe?" He lit up. "Yeah, the one where you couldn't teleport unless you said the magic word, right?" She smiled. "And remember how we had to keep each other honest so nobody cheated?" He nodded seriously. "Well," she said gently, "real life has rules too. And sometimes grown-ups don't follow them. They tell only part of the truth to win the game." Milo blinked. Like cheating. Kind of, she replied. Like when someone promises you something fun just to get you on their team, even if their team isn't really good for you. I stood in the doorway watching as my teenage daughter explained emotional manipulation in a way only a sibling could. Milo looked down. But Daddy says he misses me. I'm sure he does, I said, kneeling beside him. And you'll still see him. But you need to know you're not a prize to win, okay? You're a person. And no one should use love like a trade. He didn't say anything right away. But he leaned against me, his head on my shoulder, and I knew he understood, at least in the way an 8-year-old could. The next day we visited the therapist Martin had recommended. A warm woman named Dr. Kent with curly gray hair and a soft, unhurried voice. She spoke to Milo in metaphors, gardens, seeds, storms, asked him how he felt when different people were around, encouraged him to draw pictures of safe places. Ellie sat in on the session too. She'd asked to be there for support. At one point, Dr. Kent asked Milo who made him feel the most like himself. He thought hard before answering. Ellie, he said, because she doesn't try to make me pick sides. My heart broke and healed in the same second. That evening, Martin called with another update. Their side blinked, he said. Zach's lawyer just reached out to explore options for resolution. Translation, they were feeling the heat. The freeze on the estate had rattled them. The recorded conversations we had collected, the documented manipulation, all of it, had turned what they thought was a silent takeover into a very loud legal problem. They want to settle, Martin said. They're asking if you'd consider joint custody, no trust restructuring, no new property transfers. Just drop the court motion. Do they sound sorry? I asked. Martin chuckled. They sound cornered. That night, I told Ellie. She didn't smile. Let's make sure they don't get to change the terms later, she said. Not just for now. For forever. The next morning, I received a hand-delivered letter at the apartment. No envelope. Just a folded sheet of paper with my father's unmistakable handwriting. You've embarrassed this family. You've turned your daughter against us. And for what? You'll never have the power to change who we are. I folded the paper quietly and placed it in the evidence folder. Because this wasn't about changing who they were anymore. It was about protecting who we were becoming. And that was something they'd never control again. The formal mediation took place on a rainy Tuesday in a nondescript office building downtown. Not a courtroom, not a family estate. Just a rented conference room with beige walls, fluorescent lights, and the stiff tension of people used to being in control suddenly realizing they weren't. Martin and I arrived early. He laid out our folders like a general preparing for war. Across the table sat Zach, my father, and their lawyer, a smug man in an expensive charcoal suit who wouldn't meet my eyes. My mother wasn't there. According to Martin, that was intentional. She plays soft, he said. They probably think removing her from the room will make this seem less emotional. It didn't matter. I was past emotion. I was here for clarity. The mediator was a calm, firm woman named Judge Bennett, retired from the circuit court and respected for her no-nonsense approach. She opened the meeting with a simple statement. This is not a court of manipulation. It's a room of facts. And everything said here today will be documented. My father flinched. Zach looked like he wanted to bolt. Good. Martin began by presenting our case file. Emails, audio clips, legal documents, witness statements from Aunt Lydia and even Andrew, who had submitted a sworn affidavit about his knowledge of the estate modifications and his father's deliberate exclusion of me. Judge Bennett read the affidavit aloud. Rachel's removal from the Monroe Trust structure was intentional, premeditated, and discussed privately with the intent to redirect assets through her ex-husband and their son. Zach's lawyer tried to argue protective intent. Martin shut that down with a printed screenshot of the text Zach had sent my father. She won't fight. She's too busy with art and her little gallery job. The room went silent. Then, Judge Bennett looked directly at my father. Sir, were you aware your granddaughter recorded conversations indicating an effort to alienate Rachel from her son? He didn't answer. Sir, she pressed. She shouldn't have been eavesdropping, he muttered. There it was. No remorse, only irritation that he got caught. Judge Bennett leaned back in her chair and steepled her fingers. Then, let me be very clear, if this case proceeds to court, the evidence supports not only a block on the estate transfer and custody changes, but also a potential claim of intentional emotional distress and fiduciary misconduct. Zach finally spoke. We're willing to walk away from the trust modifications. Judge Bennett raised an eyebrow. All of them. Yes, he said. And custody original terms. Joint. We won't pursue full custody. He didn't look at me when he said it, but I looked right at him. And I saw what I needed to see: fear. Not for himself, but for how Kayla and her wealthy parents might react once they saw the headlines Martin had drafted for the press just in case. I turned to Judge Bennett. That's not enough. Zach's lawyer narrowed his eyes. What more could you possibly want? My children's protection, I said. Full recognition that both my kids are equal beneficiaries in any future family, trusts Madison included. And I want neutral third-party oversight of any grandparental visitation until my children are old enough to make their own decisions. Martin slid the documents across the table like a magician revealing the final card. Zach's lawyer glanced at my father. My father looked furious, but also beaten. Judge Bennett nodded. Those terms are reasonable. If you reject them, we proceed to court and consider civil penalties. There was a long pause. Then finally my father nodded stiffly. And just like that, the fight was over. We didn't shake hands. We didn't smile. We signed. We filed. We stood. But before we left, Ellie stepped forward. She looked at my father, her voice steady. You tried to erase my mom, but she's still here. And so am I. He stared at her, speechless. She turned and walked out head high, and I followed her, feeling like for the first time in my life, I wasn't following anyone's shadow anymore. In the weeks after the mediation, our lives began to settle, not into the way they were before, but into something sturdier, something ours. I finalized the paperwork that ensured equal beneficiary status for both Madison and Milo, locking it in with a new legal trust overseen by a neutral financial manager. My parents no longer had the authority to alter or redirect funds without third-party oversight, and any attempt to influence that trust would now be flagged legally. It was more than a victory. It was a boundary. For the first time in decades, a line had been drawn, and I wasn't the one on the defensive side. Milo started asking fewer questions about the lake house, the magic of that place, the curated grandeur. The whispered promises had dimmed after he overheard Zach's lawyer arguing against his mother's emotional instability. Even a child, it seemed, could feel when love came with conditions. But the real change, the one I hadn't anticipated, came from Madison. She blossomed. The girl who once kept her observations to herself was now open, assured, and more vocal than ever. She took an interest in debate clubs, started helping with community legal clinics for teens, and even wrote a short piece about emotional gaslighting in families that was published in her school paper. She told me one night over pasta, I used to think being quiet made me smart. Now I know speaking up makes me strong. I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. You saved me, I whispered. She shook her head. No, Mom, I just held the flashlight. You walked yourself out. The following Sunday, Aunt Lydia came over for dinner. It was the first time in 15 years she'd been welcomed at a Monroe family gathering, though this time, the word family meant something different. We sat around my modest kitchen table laughing over memories she and I had never gotten to share until now. Milo asked her if she was the cool aunt from the stories. She winked and replied I was the truth teller. That's a different kind of cool. When she left, she hugged me tightly and whispered, You broke the cycle. Do you know how rare that is? I didn't answer. I just nodded, holding back tears. A week later, I got a letter from my mother. Handwritten. Delivered by courier. It wasn't an apology. It was an explanation. Or what she thought was one. She wrote that everything they had done had been for the family, that they feared I'd ruin the legacy with my unpredictability, that they couldn't risk another scandal after Lydia. She ended it with, We hope one day you'll understand the pressure we were under. I folded the letter and filed it away with the rest of the documentation. Not out of spite, but because it proved exactly what I already knew they hadn't changed. They'd simply lost, and losing control for people like them would always feel like betrayal. But I wasn't bitter, because I had gained something far more valuable than any trust fund lake house or curated photo album. I had truth. I had my daughter's respect. I had my son's quiet trust. And I had finally found the voice I had buried beneath years of pleasing. One evening, as I watched Madison and Milo build a blanket fort in the living room, I realized that I wasn't afraid anymore. Not of my father's judgment, not of Zach's manipulation, not of being the outcast. Because the outcast, it turned out, was simply the one brave enough to walk away. Autumn passed into winter, and with it came a stillness I hadn't felt in years. Not the kind that comes from nothing happening, but the kind that comes when you know deep in your bones that you are finally free of someone else's script, that you are living on your own terms. In early December, I received word from Martin that the new trust paperwork had been finalized and sealed. The Monroe family estate, at least the portion assigned to my name in earlier documents, was now protected irrevocable and under independent oversight. My parents could no longer modify it, reassign it, or manipulate it through any back-channel deals with Zach or anyone else. It was done, but what lingered wasn't just relief. It was mourning, not for the loss of the estate, but for the realization that my family, my blood family, had never really seen me for who I was, only who they wished I'd been, or who they feared I might become. And still, I didn't feel bitter. Not anymore. Because now I could see clearly the things they tried to control, suppress, or steal. Those were the very things that made me strong. One night, as snow drifted down in soft silence outside our apartment windows, Madison joined me on the couch with a mug of cocoa and her laptop. She'd been working on a college essay, one I hadn't read yet. "I want you to see this," she said, and passed it over. The title made my throat tighten, what my mother taught me by refusing to be erased. I read in silence. Every line sharper than the last, every sentence revealing not just what she had witnessed, but how deeply she had absorbed it. She wrote about courage not being loud but consistent. About how telling the truth wasn't just for justice, it was for healing. About how love that comes with terms isn't love at all. By the time I finished, I was crying. She leaned her head on my shoulder. "You were my lesson. And my proof." "I was just surviving," I said softly. "No," she whispered. "You were becoming." After that night, things moved forward in ways I hadn't expected. Zach, now thoroughly distanced from my family and, with his reputation slightly tarnished in the local business circle, sent an email through Martin's office. No apology, just a request to maintain civility for Milo's sake. I agreed, but only in writing, with every exchange documented. Milo continued therapy. He began to understand in small ways that some of the promises made to him weren't entirely about him. And slowly, he stopped asking about the lake house. Instead, he started asking questions like, "Can I come to your gallery after school?" Or, "Do you think I could paint like you, Mom?" I didn't need the Monroe legacy, because I was building my own. Around February, my father's birthday came and went without a phone call, a card, or a mention from me. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel guilty. I felt grounded. Because absence isn't always a wound. Sometimes it's a boundary. Later that month, I received a message from a distant cousin, one who had been silent through the whole ordeal. She wrote, "I watched what you did. I wish I'd had the courage when it happened to me." I sat with that message for a long time. And then I responded, "You still can." The ripple was starting. It wasn't about revenge. It was about resistance, quiet, intentional, permanent. The kind that echoes through generations, not because it shouts, but because it refuses to disappear. Spring arrived with a kind of quiet triumph. The trees outside our apartment bloomed with pale pinks and soft greens, and life settled into something steady, something real. My gallery had finally reopened at full capacity, and for the first time in years, I was doing more than just surviving, I was creating again. Milo's drawings, once filled with castles and monsters, now featured families that looked like ours. Sometimes the people had wings, sometimes capes. But there was always a mom in the center smiling, holding two kids by the hand. He'd started calling me Supermom after Ellie jokingly called me that one night while I fixed a leaky sink and edited a school essay at the same time. At first I laughed it off, but part of me cherished it. As for Ellie, she had been accepted into 2 universities already, both with strong law programs. She told me she wasn't sure whether she wanted to be a lawyer or a journalist yet, but either way, I'm going to make sure stories like ours don't get buried again. She kept in touch with Aunt Lydia almost daily. The two of them had formed a kind of cross-generational alliance, women the Monroe men had underestimated. Lydia came over often now, bringing old photos, recipes from our grandmother's cookbook, and quiet wisdom that only came from walking through fire and living to tell it. One evening, as we sat together on the back porch watching Milo play tag with the neighbor's kid, Lydia turned to me and said, "You changed the family." I shook my head. "I didn't change them. I exposed them." She smiled. "And that's sometimes the most powerful change of all." I had stopped hoping my parents would apologize. That letter my mother sent months ago was the last I'd heard from them. And honestly, that silence had become a gift. There was no more pretending. No more manipulation disguised as tradition. No more toxic legacy wrapped in gold. Just us. Me, Ellie, Milo. And the life we were building quietly, intentionally together. In April, we hosted a small dinner at our home. Ellie invited 2 of her close friends. Milo invited his best buddy from school. Lydia brought her famous lemon bars, and I cooked the family recipe lasagna that my mother used to make, except this time it was mine. No hidden motives. No guests of honor meant to shame me. No speeches pretending to include me while cutting me out behind the scenes. Just laughter, clinking glasses, second helpings, and a living room filled with mismatched chairs and real love. And that night, as I stood in the kitchen watching Madison pour lemonade into plastic cups and Milo show his drawings to his friend, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. Not because things were perfect, but because they were finally mine. Later, when the house was quiet and the kids were asleep, I sat alone in my bedroom with the windows open to the breeze and opened an old wooden box where I'd kept every document from the case. Every letter, every voice memo, every copy of every trust clause. I didn't need to look at them anymore, but I didn't throw them away because they were the proof, not just of what had been done to me, but of what I had survived and what I had protected my children from becoming part of. The Monroe name might live on in other places, in real estate portfolios, in society pages, in family trees someone else might draw. But the legacy, that now belonged to us. It was exactly 1 year after the anniversary party when Ellie and I returned to the place where it all began. Not for another confrontation, not for revenge, but for closure. We stood across the street from the Charleston Yacht Club, now bustling with an entirely different event, a wedding judging by the string quartet playing a soft version of Can't Help Falling in Love, and the flower petals scattered across the front steps. Guests laughed and took selfies, the building glowing with warm light under the setting sun. I watched it all quietly, hands tucked into my coat pockets. Ellie stood beside me, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. "You sure about this?" she asked. I nodded. "I don't need to go in. I just needed to come back here. As the woman I am now. Not the daughter trying to prove something." She smiled. "Yeah, you're not that woman anymore." I looked up at the grand white columns, the same ones I'd passed through, holding Ellie's hand, reeling from her whispered warning to leave. That night had fractured everything I believed about family, but it also opened a door I never would have found otherwise, a door to truth, to boundaries, to freedom. "I used to think if I could just do everything right, they'd finally see me," I said almost to myself. But they never really wanted to see me, just a version they could control. Ellie nodded. "They didn't expect you to choose yourself, but you did. And you chose us." We turned and walked back toward the car. On the way, she asked, "Do you think Milo will ever ask to go back there?" "Maybe," I said. "And when he does, I'll tell him the truth." Gently, but honestly. "Good," she said, "because I've learned that truth doesn't have to be cruel, it just has to be clear." At home, Milo had left a note on the fridge. "I made you a sandwich, Supermom, and I cleaned up my Legos, most of them." I laughed, folded the paper, and tucked it into a kitchen drawer. A silly note. But to me, it was sacred, because it meant something they could never engineer with estate lawyers or family slogans. It meant he felt safe, loved, free. Later that night, we all curled up on the couch, me, Ellie, and Milo, watching a rerun of an old game show, arguing over answers, passing a bowl of popcorn between us. And as the credits rolled, Milo looked up at me with sleepy eyes and asked, "Mom, are we a good family?" I didn't hesitate. "The best kind," I said, pulling them both close. "Why?" he asked, already half asleep. "Because we tell the truth," I whispered. "Even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard." He nodded, drifting off. And I stayed there a while, arms wrapped around the two people who mattered most. Not legacy, not money, not old promises whispered under chandeliers. Just love. Earned, protected, and finally, free. Sometimes I still get quiet moments when the memories return. A phrase my father once said. The way my mother adjusted her pearls before dismissing my feelings. The glint in Zach's eyes when he thought he'd won. But those moments don't haunt me anymore. They simply remind me how far I've come. Because healing doesn't always arrive with fireworks or grand declarations. Sometimes it arrives in smaller things, the soft clink of coffee mugs on a Saturday morning, the sound of my children laughing down the hallway, the feeling of falling asleep without a knot in my chest. People ask me now if I regret walking away from my family, from the legacy, from everything I was meant to inherit. And the answer is simple. No, because I didn't walk away from a family. I walked toward a future that finally made room for me. I walked toward raising children who know that love never comes with contracts. I walked toward becoming a woman who no longer bends herself into silence just to keep the peace. If you're reading this and your instincts are screaming that something feels off, listen. If someone's love requires you to shrink, mold, or disappear, know this: the love you're craving isn't behind the next compromise. It's inside the version of you that's brave enough to leave. You may lose things, but what you'll gain is yourself. And if you're lucky, like I was, you'll also gain the kind of love that doesn't need to be earned. The kind that simply stays. The kind that rebuilds everything that someone else tried to erase.